Greetings, comrades and psychonauts. This is the Acid Left with another Beyond Linguistics reading group. Today we are once again joined by Emma Stamm and Mateo Sanchez, continuing our exploration of Marcuse. Last time we read an essay on liberation, and this time we have read the aesthetic dimension. The ideas in the aesthetic dimension were, I think this was a good follow-up from Essay on Liberation. It's a different read, but in Essay on Liberation, he's documenting the countercultural tendencies and the various liberatory movements that are coming up in the 60s and 70s. And several times throughout there, he mentions that this fight is mostly taking place within the aesthetic dimension, or that's one of the ways that he sees the fight for liberation being possible today. So then going to the aesthetic dimension, which was published years later, it's a much more dense philosophical text. It is art aesthetic theory. It deals a lot with literature and plays rather than paintings, but there is some of that. He brings up little bits here and there. And that was, for me, a little bit difficult because I was unfamiliar with a lot of the texts that he was referring to. But going through and reading, I think it was a good practice to try and take that from the literary realm and see how I thought it might apply to the visual fields that I'm more familiar and honestly interested in. But I wanted to get Mateo and Emma's thoughts just briefly on the book and what they thought about it. So, Mateo, what did you like about the book?
What did I like about the book? I think, just the fact that it's developing this, as you said, the aesthetic argument from Essay on Liberation in more detail, I guess. That would be my main thing. Um, I think I like the discussion more in the context of the more political things that he's discussing there. Honestly, I think like I'm a bit further away from aesthetics purely as understood as like art. And again, I think it's a great question to think about what you just said of how it applies to other types of art, other forms, and other periods than the ones he discusses. I hope we get into that. Um, but mostly, I think it's just very clear, and I think that's something I enjoy in his writing. It's like compact and clear, and you can definitely kind of riff off of it, and I think that's useful from anybody you read. So I think that's my takeaway.
Yeah, absolutely. It is clear, even though some of the ideas are, you have to have a philosophical background, at least a little bit, I think, but it is
Sure.
clearly written. But Emma, you said you actually enjoyed this more than Essay on Liberation.
Yeah, well, that which he critiques in Marx is all of the different ways that he comes at Marx in this text um, really resonate with a lot of ideas and feelings that I've had throughout the years involved in both left-leaning scholarship and Marxist philosophy, but also in kind of para-Marxist, Marx-adjacent cultural circles where, there are certain ideas about art and what art can do and what art can't do and what counts as good art, the kind of stuff that we should like or the kind of stuff that we shouldn't like. Um, that never really sat well with me. It always made me feel a bit uneasy. And I found in this text that he articulated a lot of those sort of watery feelings that I'd had over the year very well, very clearly, and almost I felt like it gave me some ammunition thinking back on conversations that I've had over the years. Just like actually, we can look at this in a very different way, in a way that you may not have encountered in your Marxist philosophy class or in this like reading group or something like that. Um, yeah, and to echo what you've both said, it is written in a way that allows for lots of different kinds of conversations, I think, to happen because it is clear. I mean, you would benefit from having a little bit of a philosophy background, but more so than a lot of critical theory, I think it's pretty accessible. And there's a lot. There are just like so many different kinds of points that he makes under the broad umbrella of aesthetics. So it's a pretty rich text.
Yeah, I've read some of it at the coffee shop that I work at as well, like on off time, and I've had several people come up and ask to see it, flip through it, and these are mostly artists, and some of them would be completely uninterested in their ideas about Marxism, but found just flipping through it, found it pretty interesting and asked to borrow it afterwards. So I do think for Marxists or for socialists or people fighting for social liberation, there's a lot there, but also for an artist, if they're actually thinking about what their work is doing, there's some good stuff in there. And something that I notice as a through line from Essay on Liberation is, and I think this is what you were just speaking to, Emma, is his defense of beauty, of the beautiful existing. And so by that, it's also the good existing in this transhistorical context. But it's transhistorical to Marcuse because it exists in every social formation. It's not that there's necessarily an ideal beauty that has to be achieved or sought after, but it's that beauty can emerge, or at least that's how I was reading it. What do you think about that defense of beauty, and is that the type of beauty you think he's talking about? How I'm referring to it?
I can jump in and then pass it over to Mateo. I think we first have to be clear that what he means by beauty is indeed not necessarily one manifest standard or ideal for beauty in the way that we might necessarily associate with popular representations of either beautiful people or, what a dominant notion of beautiful art actually is. It is the beautiful in this philosophical sense, primarily, that can be traced through various works of art in any medium. What's interesting is that beauty as a value of art isn't, widely embraced by people who study aesthetics and take aesthetics seriously, which isn't to say that it's always disparaged. But, for example, like in aesthetics one class, the very first conversation that you might have if you've never taken philosophy of art or aesthetics or something like that, it might be something along the lines of, beauty isn't the only thing that we should value. There are so many other experiences that we can have. And proceeding from there, I think there is a strain of intellectualism that wants to push against the good or the beautiful or positive feelings and experiences that may be evoked through art. Because maybe it's seen as too simple, too easy, too facile. Maybe beauty is even seen as something that's shallow, basically. So to rescue the beautiful is to say that there's actually something very profound, very deep and complex about the beautiful, that we can't simply say, I love this song because it's so beautiful. I love this painting because it's so beautiful. We can go further and say, what is this beauty really doing? What if we all were feeling this feeling that's evoked by this painting all at the same time, and we took that somewhere else? Or why exactly is this doing this to us? So using the beautiful as a point of departure, I guess, rather than a point of arrival. Yeah, I don't know. That's kind of in my mind right now.
Yeah. Mateo, what were your thoughts on his use of beauty or defense of it?
Yeah, I don't think it's been something that stood out for me that much, and I haven't been thinking about that much, but like now that you've prompted me to think about it, I think it's also interesting he's not necessarily talking about like specific objects, right, which are beautiful, nor is he necessarily being, well, the opposite would be true, like, well, beauty is in the eye of the beholder or something, some sort of radical subjectivist position. But he's trying to defend it as, this kind of appearance of the image of liberation, right? And that's something which he's defending that is kind of transcultural or transhistorical, to the extent that there's also kind of universal, according to him, kind of limits, right, and like universal things that people want to struggle against in any set of particular conditions. So it's also interesting, like beauty as an experience of something that appears beyond whatever your particular conditions are, and which stops the effect of those, is like has a relative autonomy and can actually, have be reinserted into social conditions to positive effects. I think that's an interesting, productive, and kind of political, even in this weird, universalist sense, version of aesthetics. So I think that's useful.
Yeah, the way he introduces it in the book is by saying basically like, look, if we take the old Marxist notions that a piece of art is good because it represents that particular historical moment, etc., and then why would we still today find meaning, like great meaning, in the Greek tragedies or the works of Shakespeare?
Yeah.
And that's why, because it does reach beyond and it speaks to something deeper that he refers to throughout the rest of the book, and especially towards the end, this need for human liberation in every social circumstance. And so I also wanted to talk about this play he does between political art and
Right.
the way that he looks at political art versus maybe something like propaganda. And I know, Emma, you had some thoughts on that, especially.
Yeah, so I'm trying to remember exactly what my thoughts are because it's been a couple of weeks. I want to respond to something that you said right at the beginning of your last statement.
Yeah, go ahead.
And I can go to the political art component. So one thing that's interesting about a transhistorical understanding of beauty is that if it's a value that doesn't map onto representation, which is the major way in which the sort of art he's praising is different from the sort of Marxist aesthetic orthodoxy, is that something that isn't representative in nature can also be commodified. What makes it hard to talk about what the good or the beautiful is for Marcuse is that it's kind of like a know it when you see it phenomenon. There are traces of it in Greek tragedy or in the writing of Proust, or name any other, and even though he isn't defending a radical subjectivity, as Mateo says, there is an element of it, I think, that is also particular to the individual coming into relation with a particular artwork, because it's basically about, I think at least, an experience. And when you can't pin it down, when you can't reduce it to the value of like socialist realism, where an artwork is considered good or ideal because it captures the truth of society with a high degree of fidelity to the truth, then that's not, it's too unstable basically to be turned into a commodity. You can't put a price tag on something that you can't clearly define and standardize. As for political art, I mean, I agree with his take. I'm pretty sure I'm interpreting him correctly here. I'm worried now that it's been too long. It's like been a few weeks since I read and took notes on it. That political art is actually not as politically effective as art that transcends the realm of the political, or which doesn't have political agenda advancing as its goal, because there is a realist element to all political art. Essentially, it's so of this world. It's so it's not just that it's instrumental, that it's trying to accomplish something, which of course Marcuse and the other Frankfurt School theorists wouldn't have loved as a virtue of art, but that it it's not sublimated, it's reduced. It's reduced to something that everybody knows in a very sort of banal intellectual way. And, it doesn't evoke something that's more transcendent. At least it's not meant to. And then, I think I have my notes right here. The question that I had about this was, can there be explicitly political art, that is, art made to represent political struggle or to achieve some sort of political goal that does actually meet Marcuse's criteria, for the beautiful? And I guess to bring propaganda into it, can even propaganda be beautiful in a way? I guess that's what's coming to mind right now. And I'm thinking of like the works of Leni Riefenstahl, if either of you are familiar with that. I think Triumph of the Will, isn't that the name of the Nazi propaganda movie that she made? That's heralded as like one of the great works of cinema, but of course it was commissioned by the Nazi regime, and that's what it's glorifying. So I've just put a lot of different ideas on the table. I don't know if someone wants to pick up on them.
What do you think about that, Mateo?
I think, talking about the political nature of art and so on, I'm not sure how much I would agree with what I understand to be his argument that there's a certain, um, it's like some art is political by just by reference to its form, right? That it has a certain autonomy that makes it political and kind of transcends the pure content which it takes from given reality and kind of transforms into something else. I guess I take a more kind of pragmatic view, which would qualify political art as that which is used and is part of kind of a political machine, right? That is actually connected, perhaps because of due to its form or its content, or just by historical accident to political movements, right? So, what would qualify something as artistic would be, something as political art would be the fact that it is connected to some sort of political movement, I guess, rather than something inherent in its form. I think that'd be my take on it. I thought it was interesting, Emma, in your notes that you mentioned protest songs, right? Because in those cases, if there's a sort of demonstration and there's like a song, um, which could be or could not be specifically political, but that would be an example of something that I would consider to be political by the fact of how it intervenes in reality because of a set of other factors. But I think that'd be my take, and that would kind of go against what Marcuse is saying. Um, and I think the other thing that I was thinking about, which is one of my main questions about the text, is about this idea of, transhistorical beauty or transhistorical um, subversive potential of art due to its form, and whether that's not kind of, when you're taking it to represent a universal need for liberation, which, is something that is supposed to be shared according to him through all different societies and so on, don't you thereby kind of depoliticize that struggle for liberation because it's not related to those conditions as causes, right? Doesn't it become what Marxists would say? Well, it kind of just by universalizing the experience of oppression to all classes, you're kind of obscuring the fact that these are not givens of life, but actually reproduced by particular conditions. I think that's one of my biggest questions of the text, whether he's not naturalizing these universal oppressions that you need to specifically fight in given conditions, and if you don't connect them as causes, then how do you actually turn that into political art?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I have a good answer to that because it's not something that I had really considered. I don't know if Adam wants to take that one on. I had some other thoughts while you were talking about his writing about Brecht, actually. But that is a really good question. I don't think we should just leave it hanging completely.
No, it's a damn good question. Yeah. I think if I was thinking only in the terms of this text, I would very strongly agree with what you're saying, but I want to link it with Essay on Liberation, where he does talk about those particular battles.
Right.
So yeah, there has to be a bridge there because the ideas are intertwined.
Mhm.
And I think it's, yeah, I don't have the answer though. But I
Not
know that he does talk about fighting those and connecting them and not leaving them to be, abstract evils, but really connecting
yeah.
them to their social. Maybe it connects in the way that his defense of aesthetic form so
Mhm.
strongly, and how the how the aesthetic form, by adhering to it, you take these social forces and make them into things that can be defeated, because that's what he's saying, right? Is that it takes it away from the way we experience them as natural phenomena
Mhm.
and allows them to be a face to the oppression, and so on.
Yeah.
But there is definitely a tension there. I think that we would need to read closer with that in mind, or I
I
know
mean,
I would.
I really like, the kind of argument. I think it's definitely true of the Marxist tradition in a certain sense that, there is like everybody within a, let's say, specifically capitalist economy has reasons, like has some struggle for liberation to fight, in some dimension. Like, at a personal level, there's like the classic example that, even capitalists are kind of oppressed by capital, which is the real subject of history, right? They're like subjected to the force of having to reproduce like the system that they feel identified with or a part of. And to that extent, they're also oppressed. But of course, to the extent that, the proletariat is supposed to be the representative of, universal, like they would destroy the class separation. Like Marxism also specifies, well, we cannot just think of everybody as the same. Like if we want to struggle for liberation for all, it has to start, let's say, with the working class, or from the bottom up, or however you want to think about it. So I'm against this thing. Like, okay, we can actually convince people who are in power that they also like have something to struggle for, some liberating thing to struggle for. Like that might have positive consequences. It might be a discourse that has political force. And again, that takes me back to the idea that whether a piece of art in particular or a movement has is political and effective will depend on a certain set of other circumstances of who receives what sort of discourse in what ways and when, right? So then that really expands the kind of considerations you have to make.
Mhm. So something that just occurred to me is that maybe there can be a connection there. We can make a connection between the concerns of the working class and what it is he means when he uses the term beautiful, or when he uses like the good as an ideal.
Mhm.
The kind of, to the extent that tastes and genres of art are often associated with various class statuses. Basically, something I think about sometimes is the possibility that there is a connection between the sort of more fantastical, magical,
Mhm.
seemingly apolitical art and what is often considered lowbrow taste. So I'm thinking about like fantasy as a genre, for example, which is not generally embraced by critics, or,
Mhm.
to going to music, which is an area that I really like to talk about. One genre of music that I really like that is absolutely just disparaged by critics and people who are the gatekeepers of,
Mhm.
high culture is prog rock. Not a lot of prog rock, but there's like enough prog rock that I like that, real sort of high-minded music people would
Mhm.
just not take seriously at all because it's too silly, it's too self-indulgent, it's too concerned kind of with ideas and possibilities that aren't, grounded in reality at all, in a way that I guess to some people it makes it seem non-serious or something like that. There's probably a better way of putting it. But if that strikes a chord with either of you, I think there's something to that. Why is that? Why is there like a whole stratum of art and culture that is made to kind of appeal to the masses that also seems escapist? I watched something last night about like hardcore fans of the movie Avatar who still like get together and have like little social groups, and they're definitely not like part of the 1% or anything like that. So maybe there's a connection to be made between art that is absolutely not realistic and a kind of like a popular sensibility of the working class that, I don't know, I can't sketch it out in more exact terms than that right now. And maybe that's, I don't know, I could write a paper about it in like months and months, but yeah.
Yeah, I absolutely want to hear an acid communist space prog rock concept album. So I think it could exist. I don't know. What do you think about that, Mateo? I as well don't have an answer for that.
Yeah. I just be thinking about, again, like, the difference between what is, like our judgments about the specific art form or genre of music, let's say in this case, and sort of how we think of it in terms of who's consuming it or who enjoys it, right? So less than ask like, okay, what are the, as maybe Marcuse would do, like, does prog rock fit the kind of content form structure that he kind of develops as having political potential? Like, instead of thinking of it in those terms, like, well, what is prog rock or what is Avatar doing, right, within those spaces and to those people? Like, is it a form, is it a place where they find a form of enjoyment that kind of takes them out of their daily concerns? Does that mean that it offers this space of transcendence, or does that mean that it does this, something he mentions as well, this kind of reconciling effect of artistic enjoyment, where like it kind of diffuses political energy, let's say, that could be kind of directed elsewhere? And those are like questions you have to look at specifically in specific contexts. I don't know, even perhaps, and then you can ask about, types of music which are like, say, like have political lyrics. Like, what are they doing as well? What are they achieving? Are they raising consciousness and enabling their audience to question things and, do other things with their life? Or is it just kind of this consumption of a kind of progressive and alternative performance? So these are very practical questions.
Well, yeah, because I mean, so to apply it to prog rock, there's absolutely prog rock out there in general that I think is liberatory in a lot of senses. It's like giving stories, narratives about overcoming obstacles. Usually, it's like sci-fi movies a lot of the times. Or at least maybe that's what I think, is I think the ones that lean towards sci-fi are maybe more likely to have that, whereas ones that lean towards fantasy, and I start thinking about like power metal and stuff like that, like Iced Earth and things like that, where they have these very fantasy laden things, but those stories that they seem to tell are much more reinforcing the social norms of today and of yesteryear too. They tend to be highly patriarchal, sexist. So like the Iced Earth is an interesting example too, because that guy that was behind Iced Earth is a mega conservative. He was at the January 6th Capitol riot, etc. But I don't think that can't condemn the whole genre. Obviously, there are stories that you could tell that would sound like prog rock or power metal that could be liberatory, that wouldn't reinforce the social norm, but give a face to the social forces that we experience and allow a way of imagining to overcome them. Because he says that the whole thing about art is that, what is it? Its categorical imperative is that it ought not to remain.
Yeah, things have to change. Or...
Yeah, that's the categorical imperative of the art that he's talking about as liberatory.
Right.
That it insists things have to change, and that's why it shows you those things. But there's, I also think there's a difference. So are y'all familiar with like Rage Against the Machine?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
and
a great example.
Yeah, but have you heard of Prophets of Rage?
I don't think so.
So Prophets of Rage came out a few years ago, and it's the band members from Rage Against the Machine, except minus Zach De La Rocca, the vocalist, and it has Be Real of Cypress Hill fame and Chuck D of Public Enemy fame as the vocalist. Yeah. But to me, and I could be wrong here, but to me, listening to Rage Against the Machine has a liberatory feeling to it. Mm-hmm. It feels very much rooted in insisting on the world that can change. Whereas listening to Prophets of Rage, even though I like Tom Morello as a person, feels like a parody of Rage Against the Machine.
What's up with the name? Do you know why because I guess the name itself almost seems indicative.
Yeah.
Well, because I mean, words? Like prophets and prophets, PH and FI.
I can't recall the spelling. But they came out like around the Trump era. It's basically like, all right, now we're fighting Trump with this music, and to me, it just feels so hollow and such like play acting. And I'm not trying to speak out against those people by any means, but the experience from listening to the music does feel like.
Yeah, it is a play on prophet.
Oh, it is? Okay. Yeah. But yeah,
from a Public Enemy song called Prophets of Rage.
Interesting. Okay. Interesting. I want to listen to that song now and see how it ties in. But yeah, that feels to me very much like something done that listening to it, you get your, anti-capitalist sentiments out and you can go on and do your job or whatever because you've done the good thing by listening to the angry music.
Yeah, I think it's very different on like how you're like. I'm thinking of Muse also has a lot of like very rocky like protest kind of songs, which are fantastic, and I feel like I get more political motivation out of listening to them on my headphones in like an everyday space than I did at the concert. Where it just felt like I was building up all this like rage against the system, but then I had nowhere to like take it to. It was a cool collective experience, but it was like very much within the constraints of like the festival arena.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's like you're in a little enclave there. You're cordoned off. And maybe that's the tension that Marcuse talks about between the individual, which he's very in favor of, and individual needs, desires, and subjectivities versus individualism, which is, stifling and like this capitalist order that's imposed. That he says that art has to deal with that, and that even the socialist society won't be able to overcome this tension between individual and individualism.
Yeah, there's a lot that both of you just said that I want to pick up on, and it almost kind of doesn't matter where I start. Maybe most recent to the earlier comments. Adam, when you were talking about the different experiences between listening to Prophets of Rage and Rage Against the Machine, I immediately thought about I hadn't heard this song until I like randomly listened to a YouTube video about like the 10 worst songs of the 2010s. Some like YouTuber came up with this list, And one of the songs on it was either by the band Litature or members of the band Litature, called I'm With Her. And okay, I'm going to give context because I don't assume anyone knows it. Maybe Adam does because he's laughing, or I don't know if people know or not. But so Litature was a band that I think they put out their first album in like 2004 or 2005, and they're a feminist electro clash. That was the term that was being used back then. Basically, like electronic punk band that had members of the band Bikini Kill that was really popular. They were popular as a punk band in the 1990s. They were part of the Riot Girl movement. They were kind of like the leading band of the Riot Girl movement, which is just feminist punk, very left-leaning. And Litature kind of carried on their legacy. Like the sound was really different, but it had the main singer, Kathleen Hanna, very much had the vibe. Radical, like the kind of things that they were singing about were not liberal in any kind of mainstream sense. So for them to then, over 10 years later, put out a song that was just about Hillary Clinton and using Hillary Clinton's slogan as its main, it was so disappointing. I mean, I didn't know that song existed until a few weeks ago, but it was during the Hillary Clinton campaign against Trump, I guess, they put it out. So, when you were just talking about Rage Against the Machine and Prophets of Rage, I was thinking, like, I wonder what happened between the 90s and now that somehow seems to have defanged political music. Is it just that I was a baby, in the early 90s. Maybe I'm just putting things together differently as an adult. I'm sure we all were. Mateo, I don't know when you were even born, but part of it maybe has to do with the way that we're both consuming and producing music now, which is in a much more isolated, solitary environment, I think. When Rage Against the Machine and Bikini Kill, were at their heights, there was no such thing as an iPod. I don't think even like CD Walkmans were around very much at all back then. Actually, I'm not quite sure. But the production of music, at least, has become very isolated, I think, insofar as it's now, people sitting behind a computer making music or listening to music on a device on their headphones. And, maybe in a roundabout way, that kind of almost maps onto a different kind of subjectivity and a different kind of consciousness, a different awareness of the way that people are going to receive music, that could it find its way into the actual character and quality of the music? Could it also just have to do with music becoming ever more commodified and both, more widely available, but more productive for those who own the means, like Spotify is really what I'm thinking about. I don't know, maybe that's like a spurious connection to make.
Yeah.
I also I wanted to say a couple things more about fantasy and metal and prog rock and all that stuff, and then I'll then I'll try to stop talking. I don't want to grandstand for too long. But Mateo, when you were talking about prog rock tropes or any sort of fantastical trope as kind of being an escape, what I thought was, in some sense, yes, it can just be respite from your everyday kind of banal late capitalist life, but it can also be an escape into something that is more real, like an escape inwards, whether it's music or visual art or literature or film. We see in art outside of us something that seems to reflect or resonate with our internal world. So it's not that we're going somewhere that's completely different. It almost kind of allows us to go inwards in a way that would have been very difficult if we didn't have that vehicle through art. There are other ways to access that too. I mean, I'll bring up psychedelic use again, which we talked about in the last video that we shot, and I know that that's an interest of Mateo and mine for sure. Might probably Adam too. I don't know. The connection between psychedelic experience and left-wing liberatory consciousness. Marcuse really tries to rescue inwardness and subjectivity from its framing as bourgeois in this book. And when you have something that gives you a space where you can see things differently, where you can kind of inhabit a subjectivity or adopt a perspective that is different from the perspective of capitalist realism, basically, to use Mark Fisher's term, then yeah, I think that there can be something radical about it, as long as you frame it that way and you see it that way. Just in the way that I don't think psychedelics are inherently politically radical or inherently accommodate a left-wing worldview. If you understand the experience of going inwards into your own kind of mystical, enchanted world in yourself, that journey that art helps you take as a stepping away from a world that has become, totally disenchanted, basically, through capitalism, then you can think about, what does that other world really look like? Maybe how can I bring that back into real existence? What would it look like if people could feel this feeling sort of more readily and understand other people as having this, because we're not all worked to death and we're not all depressed because of what we see around us, as, in this completely commodified world that we live in. But to kind of wrap this long-winded comment up, Adam, you were talking about Iced Earth and the elites in Europe, Iced Earth, as being really right-wing. One comment that, or a note that I made to myself after I sent you both my notes, is that it's kind of interesting that there actually is a very well-established connection between right-wing ideologies and fantasy in various genres of art, whether it's metal music that embraces kind of, I don't know, Aryan patriarchal values, or evaluation of like some sort of Aryan race, the really awful strain of metal music that is essentially just like white supremacist, or fantasy literature, which tends, not all of it, maybe not most of it, but a lot of very well-known fantasy literature really rehearses conservative, racist, right-wing tropes. That's interesting. We're going to connect like the fantastical to a left-wing project. We have to acknowledge that there's this real connection between fantasy and the right wing too.
Yeah, I think I would also think you could connect that going on from there to kind of the stuff that Adorno and Horkheimer talk about in Dialectic of Enlightenment, because sometimes these tropes, like especially I'm thinking about in metal and stuff, they are like the reification of aggression, of the aggression principle played out. So it's about affirming domination and about like territory. It's about trying to conquer nature in a lot of ways. But there are liberatory aspects to that as well, I think. The obsession with death, for instance, in metal can break out of that by recognizing it and not running away from it, which is the opposite, I think, of that like territory dominating nature push that is also there. So, yeah.
Yeah, I actually just listened to a podcast this morning. I don't know if you've heard it. It's the Acid Horizon podcast, which is sort of conceptually on the same page as what the Acid Left is trying to do.
Yeah.
I don't know if there are any like people that are connected with both or something. Anyway, I'm going to go off on a tangent there about the left-wing scene on the internet today. So I didn't listen to the whole podcast. I just listened to the first 10 minutes, and I can't remember the guy's name. He's like writing his doctoral dissertation about like the left-wing radical potential of metal music. And he made that point that one of the things that could be seen as radical about metal is that it doesn't run away from death, that it embraces finitude as part of the human experience, and aestheticizes death maybe in a way that almost tries to make us comfortable with it. Whereas the vision of capitalism is of infinite expansion, of immortality. I think the idea of transhumanism, at least the way that most people understand the concept of transhumanism, is, essentially a hyper-capitalist idea insofar as it imagines like the infinite expansion of the self throughout time, just like capital wants the infinite expansion of markets. If you embrace negation, the negative, finitude and death in art, what you're saying is that there's something beautiful and okay with everything being impermanent. And capitalism doesn't want us to think that way. It wants us to be scared of our own annihilation. Yeah, I mean, whether writing songs about, I don't know if either of you know the band King Diamond. They're like, now I'm showing how much I really have listened to a lot of metal.
That's awesome.
They read a lot of like very theatrical songs about death and like creepy stuff. And now I'm thinking, is that really like going to bring about the left-wing revolution? I don't know. Maybe there's something there.
You are speaking about David Burke, I believe. I've talked to him. I've read his paper, or a couple of his papers. I think David has interesting ideas. I was supposed to talk to him like a year ago, and I dropped the ball on that. And that reminds me, I will get in contact with him and talk to him about metal. I also think the Acid Horizon's a good podcast. I've never talked to the guys, but I have been listening to them for a while, as fellow followers of Fisher. I want to continue this line of thought, but we have a bunch of memes, and I also want to go through those and use them as discussion points. So let me think. Which one do I want to bring up first? Unless you want to say anything real fast, Mateo, or slowly.
Many things I want to say, like comment on the whole escapism conversation in relation to Marcuse, and also about this whole death thing. I think it's interesting. I was thinking earlier, reading the text about like the connection between like individualism and transhumanism, and this kind of idea of immortality as well that you were talking about, Emma. Because it's really, like, say that Marcuse would say like death is one of the kind of existential facts that is transhistorical and that will not be resolved by class struggle, right? It's like one of the limits of liberation, so to speak. Even that, right, is like, seems to me to be questionable, to the extent that there's of course cultures that integrate death in very different ways than we do, as not really the end of something, but as a continuation of, of also people living their ancestry as present with them throughout their lives and so on. Like how the fear of death is just like created by a particular culture that is obsessed with like individual existence, as you're like a separate thing that comes out of nowhere and ends in nothing. Even that sort of fear of death, or that, like death might not be something needing of liberation. Like it might not be something that's actually oppressive in that sense of, something that terminates you. So I think there's just much more room for questioning this kind of transhistorical limits that Marcuse speaks about than he maybe gives credit for. And also because you have an epistemological problem of like, how do you know what the limits are? Like that's just very difficult to do from particular conditions. So I'm just kind of not sure how much I stand by his arguments for transhistorical criteria of art or of limits of liberation and so on. I think those are tricky.
Yeah,
But
for
please
sure.
bring out the memes.
Yeah, because there is a lot we could continue with death, but I do want to go through some of these. I'm interested here now. I'm going to bring this one up. This is yours, Emma, and you said you weren't sure if we should talk about this, but I'd like you to explain your thought process behind it. And it's because we're on the subject of death that I'm bringing it up. And here it is.
Okay, yeah, I'm going to give context for this, assuming that, some people with this who haven't seen Twin Peaks. So the background is from the TV show Twin Peaks, which was developed and directed by David Lynch. The first 2 seasons were in the 1990s, and then the 3rd season, I think, came out maybe in 2017 or 2018. It's an incredible TV show, and if you haven't seen it, you should see it. But like most of David Lynch's work, it's very, very dark. It deals with a lot of really intense themes. It kicks off with the discovery of a dead body. A young woman has apparently been murdered, and most of the series, at least for the first, actually, you know what? I'm not going to say anything more. I don't want to spoil anything for anybody. It deals with the search for her killer, and it goes into some really, really, the only word that's coming to mind is dark. It's the kind of thing where, I prefer to watch it with other people, when I rewatch it, because it's so intense.
It has goofiness all throughout it, but yeah, at its core, it is incredibly dark, the implications for what's going on.
Yeah, I'm not really doing justice to the full aesthetic mode of it, because there's a lot of humor in it too. It's a very funny show. The first 2 seasons have kind of almost like a soap opera vibe to them, where they're I don't know, like while it's very, very dark, it also kind of shines a lens on other approaches to television, like soap operas or like conventional detective TV shows, that doesn't really criticize them, kind of embraces them, but also like looks at them ironically. And yeah, it's not all doom and gloom. There's something I think that's also very transcendent and light about it. There's a spiritual component to it.
Yeah, some people call it cheesy or corny, and it kind of is, but I think it's because Lynch is embracing the aesthetic of form of that soap opera melodrama. And yeah, and that allows for these things. It's like you instantly can understand stuff, even though it is incredibly surreal at other moments. The characters, the situations, they're applicable to a lot. But anyways, let's go on with the Red Room.
Right. So if you haven't seen Twin Peaks, you should really watch it, because it's great. And so this quote, I won't read it verbatim, but I will say that the word decadent actually doesn't appear in the original quote. It comes after a long discourse about art that is, essentially what Marcuse is trying to speak about is art that could be called decadent or self-indulgent, or perhaps melodramatic even, which is, a word that can definitely be applied to the technique of Twin Peaks, where he is counterposing that kind of art with, again, this socialist realism, an approach to that very much seeks to represent reality exactly for what it is, almost as if you would be watching a movie or a TV show that felt like you just walking around in your daily life. There wasn't anything stylized about it, whereas Twin Peaks is incredibly stylized, and the whole thing feels a little bit surreal. Some moments are incredibly surreal, but even in those, not quite so trippy moments, the whole vibe is strange. So I think it definitely counts as decadent art in the sense that Marcuse means. And he's saying that kind of art doesn't do anything towards, the struggle for liberation. except that it helps us go into parts of ourselves, parts of nature and society, as it says, that can take anything into itself and sublimate it, basically. So, I mean, that might be where the radical potential of metal music lies, for example, where a lot of metal music could be considered self-indulgent and decadent and theatrical. And so you can take that and through this process of aestheticization, allow it to open up a space of consciousness, a space that you can almost materially inhabit through art that is separate from the disenchanted, hyper commodified, frankly, depressingly realist experience that is the experience of living under late capitalism. I'm saying all these terrible things about just like living one's daily life. As a, I swear I don't walk around in like a depressive haze all the time, even when I'm not watching Twin Peaks or listening to music. But I think there's a lot going on there to vindicate basically this kind of art and art that has that dark streak to it, you know, whether it's metal or David Lynch or anything that you could consider goth, which also, I mean, not David Lynch. David Lynch is generally, you know, seen as a great director by film critics, also has kind of crossover appeal as, you know, in popular culture. He's one of the few, I think, artist that kind of belongs to both worlds. But again, when it comes to like metal or goth music, or I don't know, anything that would appear on like a t-shirt at Hot Topic, it's got that kind of like spooky element to it that is generally not seen as, you know, being very highbrow. And the fact that it appeals to the masses, maybe like the working classes, the people who shop at Hot Topic, you know, what's the connection there? Maybe it is that kind of escape from reality has this sense of real potential, even though it's not normally politicized as such.
Mm-hmm.
Were you going to say something, Mateo?
Well, I mean, on the topic of escape, since I didn't get a chance to talk about it before, but I think it's a very interesting one and worth talking about. I definitely, from my work with, like on the topic of psychedelics, I very much also side against the kind of critique of escape, you know, as just like something. I feel like it's a very easy way to dismiss something and take it seriously. You know, the case of psychedelic experience with hallucinations is a particularly clear one, you know, just dismissing it all as a hallucination, but we can apply it here to like art as being something that's outside of the real world and therefore indulgent or whatever. You know, the first point to make is, of course, that, you know, an escape, you know, it's never simply that, and by the fact of being a haven from what otherwise might be a depressive realism of late capitalism, as Emma says, is worth it, and it's something that might, you know, by itself have some sort of value that might sustain, if not direct political struggle, at least the continuation of the people who might do it, right? Just giving them the resources to keep going to some extent, and that shouldn't be underrated. But then I think it takes us also to some points regarding Marcuse's writing and thinking in this book about like how he mentions, you know, he's talking about the devaluation of subjectivity, which is something he talks about in Essay on Liberation as well. And he's talking about subjectivity in terms of like non-material forces. And I think that's pretty early on. He uses those words specifically, and I think that there's a problem with how he frames subjectivity, which and as non-material, and like by doing that, I think he reinforces precisely the idea that these things are not real and escapes. And I think it's precisely the association of subjectivity with surrealism or unrealism that we have to kind of break, right? Such that all subjectivity is in one way or another material, right? And if subjectivity can grasp different things that quote unquote do not exist, it's because in fact perhaps they do in some sense, right? So instead of having to use subjectivity as a non-material force that can invent kind of transcendent dimensions of things, I think it's better to think of it as kind of perception, right? So he's also talking about sensuousness, right? So how is it possible that kind of sensuousness can translate into a transcendence of what actually exists, right? Normally we associate sensory experience with realism, like what you only sense what's exactly in front of you. And according to his argument, a kind of simple realism is kind of not very effective politically because it just represents things as they are and doesn't have this transcendent dimension. So I think it's kind of tricky for him to uphold this. I think it's more useful to think of subjectivity as very much material, and as and of these kind of transcendent dimensions as actually already existing within reality and things that we can actually sense, right? So that we can escape this argument of escapism. Otherwise, you're always kind of I guess vulnerable to that criticism that you're just imagining things that aren't real. And I think his setup of subjectivity as non-material kind of reinforces that uh, instead of offering an alternative.
Yeah, I mean, I actually agree with you there. I mean, there is, one might say that the problem with seeing, that which you escape into, or these alternative realities as immanences, rather than spaces of transcendence. At least, this is something that, immediately occurs to me, although I think there's a way out of it too, is that if it is real in that particular sense, then, could it also be commodified, which is to say that if we, by construing it as immaterial or as belonging to a different, less real regime of experience, are we also safeguarding it from, commodification, essentially? But, that's also assuming that what it is to tangibly exist and what it is to be real is to, again, to be capable of being standardized, to accommodate standardization, to accommodate translation basically into the commodity form. That's what I'm trying to say. And that's not necessarily true of, what we call reality. I think sometimes about the idea of, kind of competing notions of reality that, some are more accommodating of the capitalist project and others aren't. So if we say, for example, that spiritual experiences aren't real because they can't be proven through the scientific method, because they're non-positivist, we're sort of cordoning off what we call reality from, whatever religious people go to worship on Friday night or Sunday morning or something like that. But we live like with a religious worldview, or with a specifically like culturally oriented worldview that includes what, for example, me as someone raised in the secular West would say isn't real. Then you are allowing for basically that kind of materiality. Indigenous worldviews, for example, or Mateo, what you might have been getting at when you were talking about the way some cultures view death, for example, death and individuality. So, yeah, that I'm not sure I have more to say to it than that. That's just what comes to mind.
Yeah, I think like the topic of spiritual experience is pretty interesting. Also in light of all sorts of debates about the role of mindfulness and yoga and so on, and either pacifying the workforce or whatever. When he's talking as well about this kind of part of the individual's existence that exists outside of its social existence, right? Something you also asked in your notes about this, individualism against participating, like individual inwardness against participating in exchange, right, of services and goods, and how spiritual experience seems like the kind of paradigmatic form of just being and sitting with yourself, right? And it seems like this experience, which is in fact outside of all these relations, which might be or not uh, oppressive, and it's just a very complicated thing to think about because, of course, a lot of these forms of spirituality, well, all of them are, of course, transmitted materially through either books or like guides and teachers, and like they have material practices, right? The way that you tap into an experience which is ineffable or beyond translation into a commodity form is in fact a material process, not like a private thing that
Mhm.
spontaneously arises. There are techniques to actually bring them about. um, so that already complicates things. But I like thinking of spirituality and these experiences in the sense that they are very material experiences. They're not inward, but precisely they're a particular form of engagement with your outside world, right? Like
Mm.
sitting down and closing your eyes is not looking inward. It's just a very particular relationship you put yourself in relation to the room you're in, or the kind of dynamic that you have of like having feeling constantly that you have to be doing something. And I think that's really cool. This kind of ability of spiritual practice to like stop what he calls somewhere like the incessant dynamic of having to strive to remain alive. And I think that's a very powerful experience.
Mhm.
And to the argument of his sort of what experiences can show you alternatives to this kind of outward society of capitalist relations. I think normally the experiences where we find alternative values to those of simple exchange are actually social ones, right? It's like perhaps a particular relationship you have with somebody really shows you that you can do something for someone, uh, not in exchange for something else. And I think these
Mhm.
are the kind of alternative spaces which they're not inward, but precisely the contrary. It's in sort of certain social interactions where you learn that the possibility of relating differently actually exists. And to think of spiritual meditating as an individual thing that you do and look inwards is I think, kind of misrepresenting and obscuring the social nature of that practice.
Yeah, that's yeah. So that made me think of actually a project that I've been working on. Actually, it was the paper that I was telling you about before we started recording. Um, as far as I understand meditation, what meditation does is not to bring you into your own thought process in a way that pulls you away from your surroundings, but it's supposed to put you in touch with your surroundings. So if your
Exactly.
mind is as calm as it can be, um, you hear more. You if you're sitting there with your eyes closed, your senses open up, ideally, and your mind calms down so that, your sense of smell maybe becomes sharper. You become more acutely aware of like the temperature in the room or something like that. And in that sense, you're going out into the world. You're not going into yourself.
Mhm.
And not to, I mean, I don't know if there's, one specific definition or goal of meditation, but I have heard it said that that's people misinterpret meditation as being about going inward, but really it's supposed to be about going outward in that particular sense. So what I've been writing about a lot recently
Mhm.
is the idea that I think is suggested to us in the modern world that our interior spaces, our thoughts and our feelings, like the landscapes of our mind, are infinite, and that mental activity is infinite, so that we can always kind of be within ourselves and explore more and see more within ourselves, to this, basically to no end. Um, the idea that the self is limitless, essentially. I think that that idea of what it means to have a subjectivity, or what it means to think. I've been dealing with like the Deleuzean notion of the image of thought. It accommodates this idea that our minds can basically be endless producers of value. So to give a very crude example, but a very tangible example, we live in an age where it very much benefits certain companies, certain like owners of means, for people to always have something to say, basically. And I'm just talking about social media here. This idea that everything in your mind is super valuable. You should have an opinion on everything. You should always be telling your story. You should always be commenting and posting. And your mind is this constant producer of something that can bring glory to you. And, it might bring you a lot of attention. It could even bring you money if you decide to monetize it, like literally as an influencer. That wouldn't really be possible. We didn't have this notion of the inner self as something that never shuts off. Every single one of your thoughts is valuable, and it can always lead to other valuable thoughts. I'm not sure that that's true of selves. I think that, there is a limited value to each of us as individuals, even though we may not want to think of it that way. And, when I say value, I just mean, in the sense of what other people would value, what can be turned into something that is of value to society, basically. None of us are infinitely interesting, basically. Even if we're all very interesting, we're not like infinitely interesting. So yeah, I'm afraid I'm gonna like go off on a really long tangent here, but yeah, I'll kind of leave it at that, or else I'll get like way too much into Deleuze or critiques of the internet or something like that.
Man, there's so much. I guess I just want to go back to agree that those practices have much more to them. I do think there are Western bastardizations or commodified versions that are pushed and propagated of like meditation practices or yoga, etc. I do think that exists, and as utilized by big corporations, but I do think they're also absolutely missing the point, and that it is more along what like y'all were saying. Think of that with like mindfulness as well. There's mindfulness training out there that is basically designed, by a CEO of some company to shut off critical parts of your mind. But traditional mindfulness meditation is about grounding yourself and recognizing the wider world that you are in, to actually be mindful of the things, to have that experience of your body and connecting the mind body connection growing stronger can lead to liberatory thoughts, like understanding the aches and pains in your body and connecting them with your actual daily activity is kind of powerful. Understanding your breathing and how that can ground you, how you can stop certain emotional states by changing your breathing patterns is pretty powerful. But I don't want to spend too much time on that. And I was going to bring up one of my memes, but Emma, I'm going to actually bring up another one of yours because I thought it kind of fitted nicely with this conversation. Solidarity would be on weak grounds were it not rooted in the instinctual structures of individuals.
Yeah, so I just took a stock photo of dancers. There's nothing, more to that image than that. So what Marcuse is talking about here is what he sees as the flawed idea that it is, wrong to care about individuality. to put it in very simplistic terms, there is this notion in certain strains of Marxist thought, which he's pushing against, that says that individuality is really not particularly important or relevant to a political struggle. Instead, he is calling for, an affinity between individuals that incorporates everybody's individuality, so that to engage in political activity, to embrace whatever solidarity means to you, isn't to deny yourself or to deny that which makes you different from other people, but to see those differences as not something that splits you apart from other people. Basically, to say that we can all be very different people on the inside and on the outside in terms of the way that we express ourselves. And society can hold all of us in that, and can help us to self-actualize through artistic expression or through whatever it is we choose to do with our lives or how we live out our days. We don't need to all wear, drab gray clothing that's associated with a stereotype of communism. We don't need to all like the same kind of art. And by bringing those completely unique, subjective parts of ourselves into the political struggle, maybe it fuels us actually, because, that means that when you're doing politics, you're not denying a very essential part of yourself. I know that from my own experience, when I've been to protests, for example, or I've sat in on like radical groups, meeting in a coffee shop or a basement somewhere, I have sometimes gotten the sense that if I were to 100% commit myself to political activism, I would be denying a lot of who I was, like the parts of myself that just aren't recognized by that movement. And that seemed very depressing to me. I think that kind of comes from this idea. So yeah, it may not be much more complicated than that. I don't know.
No, that's great. Yeah, to
That's a good
empty
point.
out yourself in for service of the movement would, yeah, if everyone did that, then what would the movement be? What would it deliver? It would that would be the weak solidarity. I really actually, it's funny you say you just chose a stock image. I really like these dancers because dancing create. I like contemporary dance quite a bit actually. It requires such somatic knowledge, like this bodily knowledge and understanding and discipline of what they're doing. So maybe I took that in this image and related to the words as kind of linking it to the world rather than being in the mind itself. So the solidarity is not only solidarity of the mind, of ideas and thoughts. It is linked into the real practices of the world. And the two characters are somewhat pulling away from each other, but they're also kind of being pulled together, and they form a bit of a heart there as well. So it's, just this like unconscious love that grounds true political revolutionary action.
Yeah, I like that visual analysis. I wasn't even really thinking of that so much. I kind of wanted an image that spoke to, communion and individuality at the same time. And I thought, people dancing together, that's kind of what that is, not in a uniform formation, like with ballet, or, if they're going through like very calculated motions, but something more freeform like modern dance. And what you just said about being in the body and somatic knowledge kind of speaks to this conversation we've been having about self-care practices, or what's been framed as kind of neoliberal self-care practices, whether it's mindfulness or meditation or yoga, or maybe some sort of like dance therapy thing that when used a certain way, yeah, it can serve to distract people, or that can be the goal, to shut off the critical part of yourself and just relax because everything's okay and we don't need to think about these big political issues. But on another hand, getting into your body, really kind of feeling yourself, your rhythms, your cycles, getting out of your head, coming into your senses, is a way of grounding yourself in something that is both real, but that exists as separate from the, mass societal structure. In the same way that your dreams are unique to you. The dreams that you have at night while you're sleeping are unique to you, and kind of being in touch with them, gives you access to something that nobody else has access to, and that can show you, kind of the materiality of something that's different. And if you connect that with a political project and you also affirm that in other people, you want other people to kind of like feel that for themselves, and you see that as part of your liberation project, I think that can be really powerful. And that I think that Mark Fisher's emphasis on collective joy, on like dance party politics, politics of the rave. And he's certainly not the only one who's written about that. Like Jeremy Gilbert, who also worked on who still is like involved with the idea of acid communism, I think, writes about like dance party and rave politics. I think it's about joy, basically collective joy, but there's also this physical embodied component of being at a dance where you're very much in your body and not in your head, and experiencing something that is both material and separate from like materialist culture, if that makes sense.
I find
Yeah.
there's a certain tension between that sort of experience and the quote in the meme you just shared, right? Because this idea that solidarity has to be like deeply within the individual instinctual structure, so to speak, seems to also be a result of the, precisely the lack of social structure that just makes solidarity flourish in a more superficial sense between people. So we need to really develop kind of an inward sense of solidarity only where its outward expression seems to be lacking, or like where we're lacking spaces for that literally express that solidarity. But I guess when you're in a, let's say, like a rave party or whatever, and you're experiencing this collective joy, it's not about your own individual hard won and developed capacity for that collective sense of being larger than yourself, but it's actually produced by the situation itself. So in a society in which we're lacking that, the argument that we need to develop that inwardly and instinctually, individually, like, I guess it's kind of situated within that context and not just something random. It'd be great to just have the solidarity structures out there so that we would virtually not really have to work on it ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to make a really quick comment. I think maybe Adam has something to say too. Absolutely, and I'm glad you are emphasizing that, because I'm not emphasizing it enough. That the social component has to always be a corollary to the individual component. And I think you're absolutely right that we don't have the social container for that anymore. So perhaps at this particular moment, that can be a powerful part of the liberation project, is to at least start with the self, and the ways that, like, even your body, your heartbeat, is something that hasn't been subsumed and commodified. Like, that's an important thing to at least observe. But once you're really in touch with that, then you have to go out and also build it for other people, like create spaces, write things, lobby for things that allow everyone else to feel the same thing, basically. Whether it's that you take that energy and then you go and try to, I don't know, fight for socialized healthcare, which we don't have in the United States, or something like that, or the cancellation of student debt, something like that. Or even just like creating a space, like an art space that is really designed with kind of a political ethos where people can come together and meet each other and talk with each other and transcend themselves. And you're right. I think what's important about the rave isn't that you're dancing, it's that you're part of a group that's dancing. It wouldn't be the same thing if it was you shooting a video of yourself alone at home dancing to post on TikTok. What matters is that you're with those other people and you're not thinking of yourself in the moment. You're part of this kind of collective consciousness.
Absolutely. Sorry, that made me laugh. I thought of like the evolution of the raves to like the silent disco, and then maybe just like everyone's like, all right, we're gonna have a rave. We're all gonna go live on TikTok at this time. That is a bit sad. It's lacking that. I want to share this meme that I made, and to set it up, I'm gonna read a quote by Tupac Shakur, which is probably his most famous quote, not from a song. And it's, "I'm not saying I'm going to rule the world. I'm going to change the world, but I guarantee I will spark the brain that changes the world. And that's our job. It's to spark someone else watching us." And for those that don't know, Tupac Shakur, beyond being a huge hip hop artist in the 1990s, his mother was a Black Panther. And so I think that was really interesting because of that quote that I've known since I was a little kid, before I even listened to Tupac's music, probably. It was from an MTV interview. So when I read this in the aesthetic dimension, and knowing that Marcuse did speak with the Black Panthers quite a bit around this time and before writing this, I wonder if Tupac was connected to this thought process at any point. And it's the Marcuse quote: "Art can't change the world, but it can contribute to changing the consciousness and drives of people who could change the world." And that's, really strong in, I think, Essay on Liberation as well, and then brings here. So, but there is a bit of a tension there as well, because it has, I wonder, the intentionality, how much that matters if you're trying to make someone change the world, which I used a silly photo of Tupac here. But I actually do really like his vest suspenders. I don't know what you would call that. But, in his quote, he does say that it's his job. That's what he's doing. And, I think he's speaking as an artist. Like, he's saying it's the artist's job to try to spark someone else's mind. And so I think he's implying that there has to be an intentionality there, which I don't think Marcuse is actually saying.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that Marcuse is saying that there has to be that particular intention at all. In fact, I think he would disagree with that. But there's definitely a tension there. I think one of the things that can be radical about art is that through a lack of intentionality, this is such a subtle point. I'm trying to think of the most direct way to put it. When you make art, you might be going into a headspace that is very hard to convey in standard terms. Even if your art is literature or poetry, where your material is language, actually trying to express what it feels like to be in the flow of writing a story or writing poetry or painting or making music. I think that headspace, there's something ineffable about it that comes through the work of art, and hopefully affects people who come into relation with it, who see the painting, who read the novel. And it evokes something that's kind of unspeakable and something that almost can't come about through a direct intentional process. And whatever that thing is what is very difficult to capture and reproduce in a commodity form. And that's something that's magical and that I would call radical about art. I'm not necessarily saying that never happens when people have the intention of making political art. Like with Rage Against the Machine or with Tupac's music, that there's something about it that actually transcends any particular agenda, because an agenda is something that is desublimated, and we're talking about sublimation here. Yeah, I mean, maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe there is incredibly enchanted, sublimated political art, and maybe there are plenty of fantasy novels and fantasy movies that are just like Michael Bay or Disney stuff that really doesn't have it. Maybe it's all up to the individual. I don't know. It's something that's hard to kind of generalize about.
Yeah. Mateo, you, in the email you sent, you said that you maybe thought that there would be we could discuss the movie Don't Look Up in relation to this essay.
Oh, sure.
I know we're running a bit long on time, but I thought this would be a good one. I'll say this. I actually really liked the movie. I got the idea from your message that maybe you didn't. So I did make a meme trying to defend it a little bit, but it's a complicated defense. So, and it's the happiness has the last word, but it is a word of remembrance. In the last line, the affirmation carries a tone of sorrow and of defiance. And then some clips from Don't Look Up, and these are towards the end of the film. The scene where they're shopping for their last meal, and then the scene where Jonah Hill is, oh, and spoiler alert, sorry everyone, the scene where Jonah Hill is shown to be the last living person alive on Earth. So maybe, at least alive or whatever. And I use the shopping scene honestly because I could not find a good still of them actually eating the dinner before before the asteroid hits. And I thought that was actually what I was going for, is them eating the dinner. But the shopping for it, I think, works just as well for visual purposes.
Close enough,
yeah. But maybe you want to give some of your thoughts on how Marcuse's ideas apply or don't apply to this or the film in general.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm pretty happy that they ended the movie the way they did. Honestly, I think I would have hated it if it had worked out in the end.
I agree.
I think Marcuse says it like at some point. It's like, well, the moments of these little oases of kind of radical joy and like transcendence are like rare, and ultimately domination and repression always wins. Which might be true, and maybe in that sense remembrance is what we're left with. But I guess speaking to the power of if you want to say quote unquote internal defiance and kind of holding that sorrow in some sort of simultaneous happy remembrance, like speaks to the power of the film and to how much you can actually still validate and affirm life in the face of literal termination. Yeah. So maybe their stance at the end of the movie, having the dinner, is an example of precisely of it's really well chosen with the quote you said. But again, I would say like it's they're having dinner all together, right? And
exactly.
Like
yes, exactly.
That's what makes it possible.
It's like they're that's the joy. That's the thing that was worth preserving, and that's the thing that the film is saying, like, no, this is what is worth preserving. even though we're showing this like really satirical look, like dark look at, you know, contemporary
And you see it
humanity.
in the character of DiCaprio, of course, right? He kind of loses himself for a second into the kind of mainstream thing and like the possibilities of being rich, famous, and stuff. But in the last moment, he's like begging for not being left alone,
Right.
basically. So I guess
Yeah.
that
And
his character captures that as well.
yeah, I saw people criticize that end scene where they have the dinner together, saying that it was like basically telling people that we should just give up, and, you know,
Sure.
retreat. And I really disagreed with that. I thought it was telling that they chose that community and that ritual,
Yeah.
and this insistence on a bond between each other. Whereas you see the
Sure.
billionaire class, you know, abandoning Earth. The president
Freaking
abandons
out.
her
Yeah.
son. You know, like forgets that he's even
Yeah.
there and abandons him. Goes into like space or whatever. He's left alone as the last man on Earth that somehow survives. Emma, have you
Yeah, I mean,
seen the
there's a
movie?
certain
I guess I should have asked. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I wasn't planning on seeing it, so I actually I watched the trailer once like weeks ago, and I haven't heard anything about it since. So maybe I'm like just really not tuned into pop culture. So I guess Jonah Hill is the billionaire. Is that the idea?
He is Jonah Hill is the president's son. And he's just like he's
chief of
kind of
staff,
a
sounds like.
what's that?
Also, like the chief of staff or something, right?
Yeah. And the chief of staff, the president's son, who is Meryl Streep is the president, and she's very Trumpian, but she also has some like Clintonite characteristics as well.
Well,
Yeah.
there are a lot of similarities.
Yes.
Um,
But yeah, so he's just a really crude and, I mean, honestly, stupid person throughout the film. You know, that's what his character is. He's kind of this like Donald Trump Jr. type figure, where someone who's clearly only in their position because of their family, because of like the power that someone else wields. That so they're given this kind of influence, and they're a very like completely narcissistic, you know, self-serving individual. But when the world ends and the asteroid hits, after this credits roll, it shows him being one of, or presumably the only person left on Earth. And he says, "I'm the last man alive," while live streaming. So I also thought there was something there about Nietzsche's Last Man as well.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, well, you know, that makes me actually want to watch it. It doesn't matter if I know the ending. From the trailer, I remember it seemed like it almost had like a gonzo quality to it. I'm maybe completely off base here. I don't know if either of you saw Sorry to Bother You.
Yes.
If there's some like tonal similarities between the two. I mean, Sorry to Bother You is like completely wacky by the end of it. It was so surreal and strange. So maybe that's not at all what this movie was like. But
I don't think they went that far.
Okay, yeah.
No.
But there's still
think,
something. I mean, sorry.
Yeah, no. I think they also show less of like they seem to be more superficial to me in like their treatment of their kind of political object, which is climate change debacle and its relationship to social media. Whilst I think Sorry to Bother You does a better job at showing and going into the whole work, you know, the oppression of work and the kind of reward of following, like following increasing rewards, basically, and like, you know, breaking through the picket fence and whatever. I think it's clearly more, it's more politically tangible. I think maybe in Don't Look Up, what perhaps is kind of, I don't know if conformist or obscuring or something, is that there's less attention to the struggle that they actually do try and have, like a social movement try to organize instead of just showing all these scenes of them in like a TV hosting kind of interview program, right? It's more about the media than it is about the actual struggle. I think maybe there they could have done something better.
I see.
Very true.
Yeah.
And the satire. I think the satire of the bad people is a bit too easy, so it doesn't really lend itself to like learning anything productive about, you know, how they come into power, other than that just they're like stupid and silly, and like that's also perhaps somewhere to criticize the film for.
Right. Yeah. It doesn't surprise me to hear that, actually. I mean, I know that Sorry to Bother You was made with an explicitly like left-leaning ethos, whereas I mean, I don't really know anything about Don't Look Up except for, you know, the one time that I saw the trailer. I mean, maybe it is just an example of like commodified rage and commodified criticism, like buying an anarchist pin at Hot Topic and paying taxes on it.
A little bit.
Although Adam liked the film, so I don't want to say that it was
no. Well, all right. So I'll say I don't think it's not as good as Sorry to Bother You. Like that's a masterpiece in my opinion. But it is, you know, it was co-wrote by David Sirota, who's a socialist. He writes for Jacobin, and it does point out. I agree with what Mateo was saying as well. But there are strengths to it that you might not expect from a mainstream Hollywood movie. There is definitely a strong critique of the capitalist system as such, and the profit motive, and the way that these things happen. And you could apply that to, you know, today, like Elon Musk being given money to build stupid underground hyperloops instead of actually like, you know, investing in public infrastructure and transportation for people. You know, so it touches on that quite a bit, but it is lacking, especially in organizational and political work.
Right. So here the political realism, you know, the Marcuse's argument about how political realism might not actually be as conducive to political action might, you know, find a counterexample.
Yeah. There's a whole conversation maybe to be had about the value of very mainstream, major Hollywood works of art that do deal seriously with issues of capitalism. It's a conversation that's been had 1,000 times already and will happen 1,000 times again. How we represent, you know, anti-capitalist ideals and, you know, capitalist popular media and so on and so forth. I guess I'm kind of interested, since I haven't seen it, in the actual style of the filmmaking. You know, so I asked if it was similar to Sorry to Bother You, in the sense specifically that Sorry to Bother You is breaking with realism, especially by the end of the movie. I mean, it goes into like sci-fi territory, basically. And if there is a mode of the fantastical or the surrealist in Don't Look Up that, you know, does the Marcuse thing or not, you know, I don't know.
I would say it's not like that, but I think there is something, and again, this is something that I saw criticized by a lot of like the liberal commentators. It will sometimes break to nature shots that are very like cinematic, you know, like David Attenborough kind of like shots of like, you know, animals doing something, or sometimes it's other cultures. And I actually found that really moving, because to me it was like these these things that couldn't be incorporated into the actual story breaking through and reminding you, yeah, we're telling this story about this powerful country in the West, America, and how it's handling all this stuff, blah, blah. But there is so much more going on. We might be focusing on this, but these, like this indigenous tribe here is also facing extinction. This baby that just got born, this beauty of life, this asteroid's hitting in 30 seconds, you know, like I liked those splices of non-cinematic, or they're very cinematic, but non-narrativizing shots thrown in, like, and they do just kind of abruptly interrupt scenes at times.
Well, okay. Again, I haven't seen it, so I'm maybe misinterpreting what you just said. But that actually reminds me of something that I had in my notes, and that came to mind like half an hour ago, about Brecht, actually, to pull it back to Marcuse and the kind of artwork that Marcuse was concerned with. So it sounds like that strategy of breaking with the narrative and just cutting to a shot that may be unrelated to what was immediately happening before in the plot, but that is related to the greater theme and context of the movie, is almost a way of calling attention to the aesthetic form itself, because it's a clear technique of cinema. It's not something that could happen in a non-cinematized perspective. You know, when you're walking around in the street, it's not like reality cuts to another shot. That's something that makes you aware immediately that you are watching something that's constructed. Bertolt Brecht had this theory of theater. I mean, he was a playwright, that was his medium, of anti-fascist theater as, a technique for anti-fascism in theater. He developed, was called the alienation effect, where through various strategies, you call attention to the constructed and artificial nature of what's going on stage. So you would have a character come forth and literally say, and this is the play as it is happening, and now we are moving along. So, ironically, acknowledging the fact that this is a work of fiction. And the reason that Brecht thought that there was anti-fascist potential in that is because he thought that realism for the sake of realism was very manipulative. So, for example, in Triumph of the Will or in propagandized depictions of society, there's a lot of pathos, there's a lot of like real sentiment of pride or of anger at the enemy, and you're just supposed to feel what's represented in the art. It doesn't call attention to itself as a construction. But when the art does, it's kind of like everyone then enters into the space of unreality together, because the artwork knows it's unreal, and then the audience knows that it's not really supposed to suspend its disbelief, that it's there is this unreal quality to it, and that it's not just trying to evoke an emotion in you the way like your real friend would or something, for the agenda of a work of propaganda, for example. This is getting into really abstract territory, but I'm going to try to like tie these threads together. So Marcuse actually critiques Brecht, which I thought was really interesting. He calls Brecht's plays didactic, and in fact, I have this quote right here. There may be more subversive potential in the poetry of Baudelaire and Rimbaud than in the didactic plays of Brecht. So identifying Baudelaire and Rimbaud as these, poets of the unreal, Baudelaire wrote like Artificial Paradises, I think that was the title of one of his works. But Brecht was also very much concerned with unreality and techniques that would evoke a sense of unreality. And maybe that was what was going on there too, or I'm projecting a lot onto this movie that I haven't seen. But, like insofar as it really makes itself seem constructed and like a work of art, I don't know, there could be something going on there along the lines of, what I've been talking about.
Yeah, no, I hadn't actually thought about it in that sense until I was saying it right then. But I agree. I think there is a connection there. We have 2 more memes, and I would love to talk, but I think we should save those for another time because we have been going for nearly 2 hours. I have really enjoyed it. Yeah, and we've stopped many of thoughts, which I think proves that the aesthetic dimension is a useful book now, or an insightful book, one that you really can get a lot out of, even if it is things that you're disagreeing with. We've brought up some things that don't sit comfortable with us quite, but especially I think I say this because that's what I'm doing. Someone creating art with a specific leftist intention, or people that are the quote unquote online left or whatever, people dealing with memes, with video essays, with any type of content. But I apply this also to my paintings and poetry as well, because it's dealing with a lot of those same issues. There was a lot to get out of this, and I think I'll be wrestling with these ideas for some time and trying to work out, because we didn't get into it, but he does also go against anti-art, which I agreed with, but even says and collage falls into that category as well. And I make mixed media work, but I feel like my stuff, it does fit into this aesthetic form in a sense. So there's a lot to tease out there. Do either of y'all, Mateo, do you have anything you would like to close out with?
Not textually, but in terms of thanking you for hosting again, and just saying that it was great to talk about these two texts with you guys. So hope we can do that in the future again.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yeah. And is there any place that if people are interested in either of your work, make sure to let them know if there's places we can find writings or, etc.
As for me, we're still working on it, so I'll let you know for next time.
Cool. Oh, yeah, no worries. And Emma, did you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, nothing other than what Mateo said. Thank you again for hosting. This has been really great. I can plug my website. I feel so pretentious whenever I say anything like that, but I do have a lot of work up online. So it's it's oculus.com, but if you go to oculus.com, with the Oculus Rift, it'll just take you to the Oculus website. So it's O and then a hyphen before the C, and then the rest of it is just spelled like Oculus Rift. I don't know. I made the URL when I was 19. I still yeah, and I can put a link up somewhere online too. That'd be easier. So yeah, it's all there. And yeah, just thank you. This has been great.
Absolutely. Thank you. There will definitely be links to Emma's work in the description. And thanks everyone for joining us. We'll see you again another time.
Sweet.